Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another episode of the podcast. Today we're going to be talking all about trauma. So without further ado, let's hop right in. Welcome to the podcast. I'm your host and executive coach, Adam Melnick. With over a decade of experience in mental health, leadership, and coaching, I aim to help you understand leadership through a mental health lens. So let's sit back, relax, and have a chat. I remember working at a medical clinic. I was sitting at the front desk, and part of my job was to check patients in and out as well as monitor the waiting room. This was of particular importance because I worked in the homeless sector, and we had people just coming in off the streets and just wanting to sleep. Part of my job was to make sure they didn't die in that waiting room. But one day, I had a woman come up to the front desk, and she was in a frantic mood. She was yelling and hollering, and she came up and she said, "I need to see the doctor right now." My job as the gatekeeper is to determine who actually gets to see the doctor and who does not. This woman in such an elevated state, she didn't need to see a doctor. She needed to calm down. And I said to her, "Unfortunately, the doctors are all busy at the moment. Here, can I help you with something?" And she started getting quite indignant with me and began berating me, telling me that I was nothing but a receptionist, that I wouldn't amount to anything, and that I could never go to school to become anything more than just a receptionist, which is why I was working this dead-end job at this clinic. I get it. This clinic wasn't a glamorous job, but I wasn't a receptionist. I was a nurse. She continued to insult me and continued to get into my face, telling me how awful of a human being I truly was. She said she had trauma and that I couldn't possibly understand what that meant because I was a nobody. Ultimately, all this anger and hatred towards me was not healthy for anybody, and I actually had to step back and let my colleagues deal with this lovely individual. I remember after that event being pulled aside into a debriefing session where the psychologist essentially told me that I wasn't as understanding as I could have been, that this individual had trauma, and that we need to be trauma-centered, that we need to understand where these individuals were coming from and act accordingly. Let me tell you the truth, however. Trauma is often used as an excuse to treat people like absolute shit. This woman had trauma. She had a lot more than trauma going on. She had bipolar disorder, she had polysubstance abuse, and she had severe trauma dating back from when she was a child. This is just her life, and she was struggling to get it on track. That being said, it is not an excuse for her to treat me like crap. And that's what I traditionally see. I see trauma being used as a shield to justify treating people in horrifically awful ways. And in that team meeting with that psychologist, I still remember how they accused me and the other staff members of not being trauma-informed, when the truth was that psychologist was not there at the scene, and it's easy to point fingers after the fact. As they say, hindsight is 20/20. Yes, they have trauma. Yes, we should be trauma-informed. But I deserve a psychologically safe environment where I am respected. I deserve respect. And just because they have trauma doesn't mean they get to treat me like crap. Unfortunately, what I've noticed out in the community is people tend to use trauma as a shield or an excuse to treat others poorly. I remember working with an Indigenous organization that will remain nameless, and they were talking about intergenerational trauma. They were saying that the reason why they get to treat other people like crap that are not Indigenous is because of that intergenerational trauma. Because they were treated so poorly in the past, it is now an opportunity for them to treat others poorly. And unfortunately, that is a horrifically awful mindset to have. Yes, they were treated horrifically in Canada. They were oppressed. But by them getting into power and oppressing those around them in the name of intergenerational trauma and justifying it by the sins of the past, you are now oppressing the people of the present to create the sins of the future. This isn't what we do. That's not solving the problem, it's just creating a different problem. Because let me let you in on a little secret. Trauma, just like your emotions, are 100% a you problem. Let me repeat that. Trauma and your emotions are 100% a you problem. You can allow trauma to run your life, and I will be honest with you, there are many that allow trauma to run their lives. Or you can take back the steering wheel and change the direction of your life and the future you want to craft. And that's what many people don't understand. You are in control of your own trauma. Yes, you had an awful childhood. Yes, your parents didn't treat you well. Yes, you had an awfully terrifying experience. Yes, your grandparents went through something horrific. I get it. But you get to decide if that trauma runs your life or not. And this is coming from a man who has been deeply traumatized by his work, by the things I've seen, by the situations I've had to go through, and I have had to go through personal therapy because that trauma was ruining my life. However, I decided I didn't want that life, and I took back control of where my life was going. Trauma no longer runs my life, I do. So with that, let's talk a little bit about what trauma is. And trauma is an invisible wound. Think of it as a scar that nobody can see. And it's caused by an event or an experience that is so emotionally overwhelming that your coping mechanisms that you have in place to normally deal with these things get overwhelmed. And your body doesn't really understand what's happening. Like, it doesn't get how to cope with this situation. And because it doesn't understand, it needs to keep you safe. And it's going to do that by triggering your flight, fight, or freeze response. For me, when I got traumatized, I did the flee response. I want to get out of there as fast as possible. And it's going to do whatever it thinks is rational or logical within that moment to keep you safe. The problem being is that after the traumatic event happens, it doesn't end there. Your brain alters itself. It changes its structure and thought patterns to try to keep you safe. It's important to understand that trauma is a natural adaptation of the brain to keep you safe. It's a survival mechanism. But the problem stems from the fact that the part of our brain that's responsible for the "I'm in danger, I'm unsafe" signals becomes altered. And your brain isn't able to distinguish between when you're safe and when you're unsafe. One of the best analogies that I heard about trauma is when you have been traumatized, your brain is no longer able to distinguish between a paper tiger and a real tiger trying to kill you. It thinks of them as one and the same, and as a result, you act as if the paper tiger is a real tiger. This is why some individuals become extremely aggressive extremely fast. Because again, their brain doesn't understand that they're actually safe within this moment. Now, this is important. When it comes to traumatic events, what may traumatize you may not necessarily traumatize me, and vice versa. It's important to understand this and be open-minded. I have seen too many times EMS personnel, nurses, military professionals, etc. experience an incredibly traumatic event, but is often downplayed by their buddies or their friends because they didn't find it traumatic. And that's simply not true. For example, if you and me, dear listener, are working together with a patient and something traumatic happens, I may become traumatized and you may not because of many different factors, or vice versa. Our job in that moment is to understand that sometimes people can get traumatized by things that we didn't think were traumatic and look for the signs and symptoms of, hey, this person's not doing so good and they need a little extra help. Because here's the rub. Trauma is extremely common. Trauma is extremely common. I was doing an intergenerational trauma workshop where we often talk about the First Nations in Canada and the intergenerational trauma that they're experiencing. But here's the rub. In America, they've had almost 100 years of continuous war. There are veteran families, there are military families that send not only their fathers, but their grandfathers and their grandfathers' fathers, and then their sons off to war. If you don't think that this family doesn't have some type of intergenerational trauma, you're having a laugh. When we look at the Jewish people, there was the Holocaust. They had intergenerational trauma. The Armenians have intergenerational trauma. The Hutus and the Tutsis have intergenerational trauma. Holy moly, intergenerational trauma is more common than people think it is. It's not isolated to one or two groups of people. It's everywhere. And that's the same with just regular trauma. I know psychologists that have vicarious trauma from their patients. I got vicarious trauma from my patients. I also experienced regular trauma through my patients. But I've met people that aren't in the mental health field, that weren't in the medical field, who also received trauma. Because I'm going to be honest with you, if you live a life, if you are actually living your life, you will become traumatized at some point. It's just how it goes. You will experience an event in your life that is going to be so emotionally overwhelming that your coping systems will not be able to handle it. Your brain will fundamentally change because of that. And that's normal. If that doesn't happen to you, that's honestly a little weird. After you've experienced a traumatic event, after your brain has fundamentally changed, after you've received your invisible scar, it doesn't end just at the event. Your brain has now been taught to react a certain way to a certain stimulus or trigger. A trigger is anything that brings your body back to that point that the traumatic event happened. An example of this is, for me, I had a very scary confrontation with one of my patients. I didn't think I was going to get out of it alive. After that, when people really got up into my face and started being aggressive with me, my body went back to when I was in that confrontational moment, when I was in that life or death situation, and I started having tremors in my hands. I started sweating. I started stumbling over my words because I had so much adrenaline pumping through my veins because I was stressed out as a result of my body thinking that, hey, this is a life or death situation. It no longer understood that this conflict that I was having wasn't life or death. This is a safe conflict, but my body thought, hey, I'm in danger. And it's a trigger that pulled my body back from the present into the past to re-experience that event all over again. And the truth is, when it comes to triggers, they're going to be incredibly unique to you or the person that was traumatized. What may trigger me may not necessarily trigger you. And that's actually a point in therapy that we need to look out for, which is, hey, you got triggered. What actually happened that caused that to trigger? That's important. That's self-discovery of, hey, there's something that happened that led my body to this type of response. What is it? Because unfortunately, after we've been traumatized, we are unaware of the triggers that our body now has. It's not like, hey, Joe, you've been traumatized. Here's a list of all the triggers that you have that are going to bring me back to the past. It simply doesn't work like that. And how we know somebody has been triggered is that there's typically a disproportionate response to what's going on. For example, you give feedback to somebody and immediately they're yelling and screaming at you or they're berating you. This is a disproportionate response, and what's actually happened is there's a trigger. A more proportionate response is active listening, understanding that feedback and looking on ways to improve it and understand that the world's not coming to an end. But to immediately go into attack, that's odd. That is disproportionate. I also see this a lot in relationships where one partner will do something and next thing you know, both sides are in a fight, they're attacking each other, they're going for each other's throats, people are looking to break up, maybe there's a divorce happening, and when we look back at the original trigger, what actually happened, it was nothing. It was disproportionate. And that's usually your first sign that, hey, something wrong is happening. This isn't right. It should never have gotten this bad. It's important to note that when people become triggered, they might not necessarily become confrontational. I've seen a lot of people get confrontational, but not all. And what some people do is they just freeze, they just stand still, they become dopey. All thoughts leave their head, they're just standing there and they just don't know what to do and they're just completely scatterbrained. This is also a normal response. I've also seen some people just break down crying and sobbing. Also normal. I've seen some people become incredible people pleasers, going out of their way to try to make your life the best it can be, because that's what worked in the past, so why wouldn't it work now? And many, many more. We typically tend to hyperfixate on the angry, traumatic people because they're the loudest. But it's important to note that trauma can look very differently depending on the person. Now that we've talked a little bit about trauma and what it is, let's talk a little bit about how to identify it when somebody else is going through a traumatic experience. Because to be honest, a lot of the information I tend to run across is about you and dealing with your own traumatic experiences. The issue with this is that as a leader, you will be leading a team, and that team may be going through a traumatic experience themselves, and you need to be prepared to help them through that. The first thing we have to do is we have to put our detective hat on, because unfortunately when it comes to trauma, sometimes it's not so obvious. Sometimes we have to put the pieces of the puzzle together to understand the bigger picture. And how we're going to do that is, first and foremost, keep an ear out to major events that are happening within your team members' lives. If you've been building rapport, if you've been doing small talk with your people, they're going to open up and tell you about major events that are happening to them. And what you'll notice is if it's a traumatic event, this event will continuously come up. For example, I was recently working with someone whose dad had passed away. This undercurrent or this event continuously came up in the conversation. It didn't come up just once or twice, but 3 to 4 times over the course of a week. This is a clue. This says, hey, something's going on here. This has come up repeatedly. I need to pay attention. And it's the same thing with leadership. If you're sending your colleagues or coworkers into a situation and they come back and they continuously talk about that situation and what's going on with it, hey, this is a clue that something happened and we need to follow up. As leaders, one of the most basic things we should always be looking out for is patterns. Patterns are always going to be our friends. If they're a narcissist, there'll be a pattern. If they're a psychopath, there'll be a pattern. If someone's been traumatized, there is a pattern. And this discussion of patterns actually leads nicely into the next topic, which is we need to look for the triggers. Again, when somebody has a traumatic event happen to them, they're going to have triggers that are going to cause their body to revert back to that emotional state from when that traumatic event originally happened. It's going to be a pattern. It's going to be the same triggers that are going to come up over and over again. For example, you notice that every single time you talk with Jim about maybe something that he's doing improperly, he immediately becomes people-pleasing and apologetic. This isn't normal. This is an overreaction, and that should clue you in. When something seems disproportionate or an overreaction to what's actually going on. Again, we're only providing feedback to Jim, but immediately he's thinking, hey, I'm going to lose my job. I need to people please and do everything I can to ensure that I keep this job. Another example of this is maybe you go in and you pat somebody on the shoulder and they immediately spin on you and they're fuming, absolutely furious that you laid hands on them. Again, this is an overreaction. This isn't normal. It clues us into, hey, something's going on here. Other things that we need to look for is potentially exhaustion from the individual. Maybe they might be confused. Maybe they're having a lot of sadness, maybe anxiety, maybe a lot of anger, or they're just tired all the time because they can't sleep. We're noticing that this individual not only has triggers, but their moods are kind of all over the place, or they might be the opposite, where they just don't have any emotions at the moment. And that's like, hey, something's going on here that needs to be addressed. All you have to do is listen for the clues and look for the patterns. Look for the abnormalities that you're seeing with this individual, or maybe the extremes. This is going to tell you something's not quite right. And to be honest, sometimes it'll be very obvious because you'll hit an emotional trigger and all of a sudden they're overreacting to you. Maybe they're yelling and screaming. Maybe they're bawling their eyes out. Maybe they're just looking like a blank wall. I don't know. In that moment, however, we should not say, hey, it sounds like you're triggered. Instead, we just need to hold space for them. If maybe they're having a triggering episode and they're in public, maybe pull them aside into a private room to have a conversation with them. Sometimes, however, they may be incredibly angry, and in that situation, you need to keep yourself safe first and foremost. But I'm going to give you some rules of thumb. First and foremost, we need to hold space for these individuals in a non-judgmental way. We need to understand that they're going through a lot right now, and we're not here to fix or solve any of their problems. We're simply here to listen. We're not to critique them. We're just listening. They may be at an 11 on the emotional scale, but we need to be at a 3. We need to be cool, calm, and collected. Model that behavior for them. Because if we go to that 11 with them, they're going to go even higher. So we always need to be calm, cool, and collected at that 3 and invite them to come down and be with us in this calm, cool state. Make sure to encourage them and say, what you're going through is normal. I get it. I'm here to listen. And be okay with yelling and swearing and potentially throwing things. This is all normal. Again, they're in this heightened emotional state. As long as they're not yelling and swearing at you, as long as they are not throwing things at you, this is okay. Let them just do what they need to do to calm down. And we're just going to be with them. And again, in the non-judgmental space, just to listen and to help them come down from this heightened emotional trigger. Once they have come down, now we can talk to them. Now we can sit them down and say, hey, Jim, I'm a little bit worried about what's going on. I think you need to see a mental health professional. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to refer them out to a mental health professional. And they may say, they don't need it. Again, we're going to help try to convince them, but we can't force them. And maybe this is a conversation we're going to have to revisit with them down the line. And that's okay. We're trying to meet our people where they're at. Because again, as leaders, we can't fire our people. We're not here to fire our people. We're here to take care of them. And part of making sure that we're taking care of them is ensuring that they get the help that they need. Once they start receiving that help, our job still isn't done. What we need to do is continue to talk with them, encourage them, and be a place to, 1, listen if they just need to vent, and 2, maybe they're going to come back and say, hey, Adam, I noticed that every single time I'm in a meeting, it triggers me because of A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. And my job is to say, awesome. What's the plan that we can come up with to help you make it through these meetings? I actually worked with a gentleman who couldn't stand team meetings because there were just too many people. It triggered him emotionally. And so a plan was created that when he started feeling triggered, he would actually get up and leave the meeting. He would de-stress and then he would come back. And that was usually only about 5 minutes. And again, this was normal. This was okay because we were working with them, not against them. And lastly, it's important to take care of yourself. When we're working with an individual that is triggered or has a traumatic event, we need to make sure that we're doing self-care. And I won't harp on self-care because I know we've talked about it in previous episodes, but please, please, please make sure that you're taking care of yourself. So to wrap up, Trauma is an invisible wound that occurs because an event happened to you that was emotionally overwhelming to the point that your body did not understand what was happening. As a result, it altered your brain and you are no longer able to distinguish between safe and unsafe. Trauma is an incredibly common event that most people, if not 99% of the population, will experience at some point in their life. This is normal. What traumatizes you might not necessarily traumatize me, and vice versa. But also be aware that trauma is fundamentally a you problem. You have to decide if you're going to let trauma run your life or if you would like to overcome it. When we become traumatized, there are triggers or events that will happen that reopen that wound and causes our body to go back to the original event when we were traumatized. This will result in us having a traumatic response, which could be freezing in place, yelling, people-pleasing, cutting, crying, being extremely aggressive, etc. The thing to note, though, is that when we have a traumatic response that is triggered, it is a disproportionate response to what is going on because our body doesn't understand that it's safe and believes that this is a life or death situation. When it comes to working with ourselves or with others that have trauma, the first thing we need to do is look to see if somebody or ourselves is overreacting. If they are overreacting to the situation, the next question is, why? What is going on? Then we need to keep our little feelers up and look for the pattern. Hey, I've noticed Jim is always overreacting in this team meeting when this happens. That is important because now we can start recognizing, hey, I think Jim is traumatized. In the moment when they are experiencing a traumatic episode, what we need to do is hold space for them. We just need to be there for them and be unconditionally accepting of who they are. We cannot judge them. We need to be cool, calm. We need to model this behavior because they're going to be at 11. We need to be down at a 4. We need to listen to them and we need to accept yelling, swearing, throwing things as long as it's not at us. If it is at us, we simply set boundaries and we say, this is not okay. Please stop this. If you don't stop it, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to work together, but you can come back and we can try again tomorrow. We just need to be there for them and express that what they're going through is normal. After that, we need to talk with them and recommend that they see a mental health practitioner, either a psychologist or a counselor. And we need to be there for them and listen to them because they may want to talk to us about what happened or what they're going through. And we need to be non-judgmental and just open to what they're experiencing. We need to understand where they're coming from and their triggers and potentially work with them to help understand, hey, if this is triggering you, maybe we need a plan to help you cope with what's triggering you. I hope this podcast episode was helpful to you. I understand that this is a massive topic and this is an abbreviated CliffsNotes version. If you're interested in seeing more, please reach out to me at amelnick@seatingthelead.com. Or if you have other podcast ideas, please reach out to me. I'm always in the neighborhood for hearing new and interesting ideas that people would like to discuss or like to hear about. In the next episode, we talk about personal strengths, how to identify them, and how to use them to your advantage. And with that, have a wonderful evening. Cheers. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe, give it a like, and share it with a friend. And if you're ready to take the next leap and improve your leadership skills, head over to www.seatingthelead.com and book your free coaching session today.